For the entire world, she was just another broken woman in her late 50s, sitting quietly in a borrowed bedroom with two suitcases and a garbage bag full of clothes that used to hang in a walk-in closet she had helped pay for. The house was gone. The marriage was gone. And somewhere along the way, without her even fully noticing, she had gone too. But what nobody knew, what nobody sitting in that borrowed bedroom could possibly imagine, was that Fern Hargrove had not come to the end of her story. She had come to the beginning of a completely different one. And it started with a key she had not touched in 11 years, a locked cabin deep in the Tennessee mountains, and a letter her grandmother had asked her to open only when she had nothing left to lose. Before we go any further, tell us where you are tuning in from today. And if this story touches something real in you, make sure you are subscribed, because what Fern found when she finally turned that key is going to make you believe that losing everything is not always the end. Sometimes it is the only door left unlocked. Welcome to She Found Her Way Home. This is the story of a woman who lost her house to an ex-husband, drove into the mountains with nothing but a suitcase and a grandmother's secret, and discovered that the life she was always meant to live had been waiting for her all along in a place no one else could ever find. Fern Hargrove turned 58 years old in October, alone, in a Panera Bread, because her best friend Haven had forgotten and her sister Opal had called to say she was too busy with the kids. She sat at a corner table with a cup of coffee she did not really want, watched strangers carry on around her, and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Not sadness, not anger, just a terrible, hollow clarity. She was 58 years old and she had no idea who she was anymore. It had not always been that way. There had been a version of Fern before Sterling, a version she could still catch glimpses of if she looked hard enough, in the right lighting. That Fern had been sharp and funny and direct in a way that made people either love her immediately or feel slightly unsettled. Never anything in between. She had grown up in Clover Hill, Tennessee, the younger of two daughters raised by a school librarian mother who collected ceramic owls and a father who worked the line at a textile plant and coached Little League on Saturdays. It had been a modest life, but a full one. The kind of childhood where the house smelled like dinner every evening and someone always asked about your day. Fern had been the artistic one, the dreamer, the girl who filled sketchbooks with drawings that her art teacher called startlingly original, and who had gotten a partial scholarship to study design at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. She had been 20 years old when she arrived on that campus with a portfolio under her arm and the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Her first week there, she found a storage room in the basement of her dormitory that nobody used. She dragged a table down there, pinned her sketches to the cinder block walls, and turned it into a studio. It was small and poorly lit and smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals. But it was the first space in her entire life that belonged only to her. She would remember that feeling decades later, sitting in a very different room, holding a very different key, understanding for the first time what her grandmother had been trying to protect. Because Fern's grandmother, Lark Helene Hargrove, had understood something about belonging to yourself that most people spend their whole lives trying to learn. Lark had taken Fern to a cabin in the mountains of East Tennessee every summer from the time Fern was 4 years old until she was 14 and decided she was too old for trips with her grandmother. The cabin sat on 5 acres of forest in Unicoi County at the end of a gravel road that turned off a county route. Fern could still hear in her memory the particular rhythm of stones under tires, the way the trees thickened as you climbed, the way the temperature dropped noticeably in the last half mile. Fern had stood on that porch one morning when she was 4, watched the mist move through the trees below the ridge, and asked her grandmother if the mountains were breathing. Lark had answered without hesitation, Yes, baby, they breathe all the time. You just have to be quiet enough to notice. Lark did not teach Fern technique when they drew together on that porch. She taught her how to see. Do not draw the tree, she would say, pointing with her pencil at the ridge line. Draw the way the light chooses that tree instead of the one beside it. Fern was 8 years old when she told her grandmother that the cabin smelled like the best version of everything. Lark wrote that sentence in her journal and told Fern years later that it was the truest thing she had ever heard a child say. There was something else Fern remembered about those summers, a detail she had dismissed as a child and would not understand until she was 58 years old, sitting in her sister's spare room with a tin box in her hands. In the sleeping loft upstairs in the corner nearest the north wall, there was a loose floorboard. Fern had asked about it once. "Why don't you fix it?" Grandma Lark had looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile and said, "Not everything loose needs fixing. Some things are loose because they are holding a place for something." Fern had not understood. She was 8, but Lark had not been talking to the 8-year-old. She had been talking to the woman Fern would eventually become. Fern was 23 when she met Sterling Redmond at a gallery opening she had helped organize for a senior student's thesis exhibition. He was 27, already working in real estate, and he had the specific confidence of a man who was accustomed to walking into a room and occupying it. He was funny in an unexpected way. He noticed things, and he looked at Fern with an attention that made her feel chosen in a way she had never experienced before. They dated for 2 years and married when Fern was 25. The wedding was in Clover Hill in the backyard of her parents' house, and it was the last time Fern's grandmother Lark met Sterling Redmond face to face. Lark had pulled Fern aside during the reception, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone else would have noticed. She simply took Fern's hand and walked her to the far end of the porch, where the music from inside was softer and the afternoon light came through the oak tree in long golden bars. Fern, Lark said quietly, looking not at her granddaughter, but at Sterling through the kitchen window, where he was laughing with 3 of his friends. "I notice he smiles a great deal, but I also notice he only smiles when people are looking at him." Fern had laughed it off. She was 25 and in love, and the afternoon light was gold, and she had no framework yet for understanding what her grandmother was really saying. Lark did not push. She never pushed. She simply reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small tin box painted faded green with a pattern of vines along the lid that had been worn almost smooth from years of handling. She pressed it into Fern's hands with a firmness that did not match the gentleness of her voice. "Keep this somewhere safe," she said. "Not somewhere Sterling can find it. Somewhere that is only yours, and do not open it until you need to. You will know when that is." Fern had tucked the box into the bottom of a suitcase and forgotten about it for 30 years. She understood now, standing on the other side of a marriage that had spent most of its middle and final decades slowly and methodically teaching her to take up less space, exactly what Lark had seen in that kitchen window, exactly what that smile had meant. It had not happened all at once. That was the part that still made Fern's chest tighten when she let herself think about it too directly. There was no single dramatic moment she could point to as the turning point. No explosion. No confrontation that would have given the dissolution a clean shape. It had been quieter than that, and more dangerous because of its quietness. A comment about a design choice she was proud of that Sterling called too risky for actual clients. A suggestion, gentle at first, that maybe she should focus on supporting his growing real estate business rather than chasing freelance contracts that barely covered her studio rental. A gradual reorganization of their shared calendar that seemed logical on paper, but always managed to place Sterling's obligations at the center and Fern's around the edges. There was one moment she could point to, though, One specific moment that she carried with her like a stone in her pocket for 15 years without ever telling anyone about it. She had been 42 years old. Sterling had asked her to design the marketing materials for a new commercial property his firm was developing. She had spent 3 weeks on it. The layout was clean and striking, and she knew it was some of the best work she had done in years. She had felt for the first time in a long time like the version of herself that used to fill sketchbooks and pin drawings to cinder block walls. 2 days before the presentation, she walked into Sterling's home office to ask about a printer setting and saw the proof copy on his desk. Her name had been removed from the design credit line. His name was in its place. Sterling Redmond Creative Direction. She stood there looking at it for what felt like a very long time. She could hear him on a phone call in the next room laughing about something using that voice he used when he wanted people to like him. She picked up the proof. She set it back down, and she said nothing. Not that evening, not the next day, not ever. That was the moment she realized years later in therapy when she began to disappear. Not all at once, but the silence she chose in that home office became a template. It became easier to say nothing the next time, and the time after that, and the time after that, until silence was not a choice anymore, but a reflex. And the woman who had once been sharp and funny and direct had been so thoroughly edited that the original draft was nearly unrecognizable. By the time she was 40, she had given up her studio. By 45, she had stopped taking design clients entirely. By 50, she was managing the administrative side of Sterling's real estate firm, organizing his schedule, preparing his presentations, answering emails in his name, and telling herself that this was still a partnership. That contribution took many forms. That her creative work would always be there waiting for her when things slowed down. Things never slowed down. Sterling's author Petra Redmond had not helped. Petra was 83 years old now, a woman of considerable social energy and very specific opinions about the roles people were supposed to play. She had initially opposed the marriage, telling Sterling privately that Fern was not from the right kind of family, which meant not from a family with money or connections that could advance Sterling's career. But when Petra saw how useful Fern was, how efficiently she managed Sterling's professional life, how gracefully she handled the entertaining and the correspondence and the thousand invisible tasks that made Sterling look successful, Petra's opposition transformed into something more insidious. She began treating Fern as staff. There had been a dinner. Fern was 48. A holiday gathering at Petra's house with Sterling's extended family. Petra had turned to Fern at the table in front of everyone and said, "Fern, you should be grateful that Sterling gave you a life you never could have built for yourself." The table went quiet. Fern smiled politely. Sterling said nothing, and his silence was louder than anything Petra had said because it confirmed what Fern had been trying not to see for 23 years. In Sterling's mind, his mother was not entirely wrong. She raised the issue once, only once, on a Sunday morning in their kitchen when the children they had never managed to have would have been sitting at the table eating cereal, and the whole unbearable weight of that absence pressed down on her without warning. She told Sterling she felt invisible, that she felt like she had been slowly edited out of her own life, that she missed the version of herself that had existed before she had gradually reorganized every one of her own ambitions around his. Sterling listened with the expression he wore in difficult client meetings: patient, attentive, and fundamentally unreachable. He said he understood she felt that way. He said he was sorry she was struggling. He suggested she talk to someone, meaning a therapist, meaning the problem was a weather system inside Fern rather than a pattern that existed between them. She went to therapy. The therapist was excellent and helped her see the pattern clearly. Sterling did not go to therapy. The pattern continued. What happened 3 months after Fern's 56th birthday was that Sterling came home from a conference in Nashville with a plan that did not quite make sense for late November and a distance in his eyes that she recognized before she could name it. 6 weeks later, he asked for a divorce. He was not unkind about it. That was perhaps the cruelest part. He was measured and reasonable and even sympathetic in the way of people who have already grieved the relationship privately and arrived at the difficult conversation fully processed. He said they had grown apart. He said he had deep respect for her. He said he hoped they could handle things civilly. What he did not say, not that evening, was that he had already consulted with Lawson Dunmore, the attorney Fern had always considered their family's legal contact. What he did not say was that he had spent the better part of the previous year quietly restructuring the financial architecture of their shared life in ways that would only become visible after she signed the initial separation documents. And what he certainly did not say, what Fern would not discover until much later, was that Sterling already knew about the cabin. He had found the property tax records years earlier, buried in old files from Lark's estate, 5 acres in Unicoi County, a seasonal cabin. He had looked at the assessed value and dismissed it, a shack on a mountain. He had called it privately, not worth mentioning. But he had also made a deliberate decision not to include it in the asset disclosure during the divorce proceedings. Not because he wanted Fern to have it, because he did not want her to use it as leverage to negotiate for more of what he considered his. By the time Fern had her own legal counsel, a young attorney named Merritt Bancroft, whom she found through a referral from Haven, the landscape had already shifted in ways that were technically legal and practically devastating. To understand what Fern lost in that courtroom, you had to understand what she had built. She had found the house on Birchwood Drive herself on a rainy Wednesday afternoon with a realtor who kept apologizing for the water stain on the dining room ceiling. Sterling had been dismissive of it, initially calling it too old, too much work, too far from the commercial districts where his connections were concentrated. But Fern had walked through those rooms and felt the particular stillness that comes when a space speaks directly to something in you that does not have a rational voice. The bones were extraordinary. Wide plank hardwood floors throughout. A kitchen with south-facing windows that would flood the room with afternoon light. A back garden that was overgrown and completely salvageable and had an old dogwood tree at its center that was already blooming pink despite the March cold. She had spent 14 months renovating that house, choosing every fixture, every paint color, every piece of hardware. She had refinished the hardwood floors on her hands and knees over 2 weekends, while Sterling attended a conference. She had sourced the kitchen light fixture from an estate sale in Chattanooga, driving 2 hours each way, because she had seen a photograph of it online and known immediately that it belonged in that room. Sterling had been proud of the house. She would give him that. He had shown it off at dinner parties and described the renovation to colleagues with a proprietary enthusiasm that increasingly used the word "we" in ways that smoothed over who had actually done what. We refinished those floors. We sourced that fixture from Chattanooga. Fern had smiled and refilled glasses and said nothing, adding it to the long internal inventory of small erasures she had agreed to absorb. The house on Birchwood Drive, the one she had found and renovated and filled with 19 years of Thanksgiving dinners, was awarded to Sterling, his name on the mortgage, his income documented. Fern's decade of contribution existing almost entirely off the books. She sat in the courtroom on a gray Tuesday in February and listened to the judge read the settlement terms. And while he read, she looked down at her hands in her lap and realized she was cracking her knuckles, a small nervous habit she had carried since childhood. Sterling had told her to stop doing it hundreds of times over the years. He said it was unladylike. He said it bothered him. and she had trained herself slowly to suppress it around him. But here in the courtroom with Sterling sitting 12 feet away and a judge dividing the physical evidence of 30 years into two unequal columns, her hands were doing it on their own, as if her body was reminding her of everything she had given up. Every small piece of herself she had surrendered because someone else found it inconvenient. She stopped. She looked at her hands. And she understood with a clarity that felt like a door closing behind her exactly how much of herself she had lost. Merritt Bancroft walked her to her car afterward. He was young and earnest and genuinely sorry, and he said the truest thing anyone had said to her during the entire process. The law measures numbers, Mrs. Whitfield. It does not measure sacrifice. The settlement she received was not nothing. There was a cash amount that would sustain her for approximately 2 years if she was careful. A small portion of a retirement account and the personal property she had managed to document as exclusively hers. But the house went to Sterling, and most of what she had built inside it went with him. She drove to Haven's house, sat on the couch, stared at the wall for 45 minutes without speaking, while Haven made tea and did not push because Haven had known Fern long enough to understand when silence was the only honest response available. 2 weeks later, she packed the last of her things from Birchwood Drive. Sterling stood in the kitchen pretending to be busy with his phone while she carried boxes to her car, and neither of them spoke until she reached the front door for the last time, and he said without looking up, "I hope you find what you are looking for, Fern." She did not answer. She walked out and pulled the door shut behind her and drove away. And when the dogwood tree in the back garden disappeared from her rearview mirror, she felt the specific grief of someone losing something they built with their own hands and were not allowed to keep. Then she drove to Clover Hill with 2 suitcases and a garbage bag of clothes, walked into the yellow spare room in her sister Opal's house, sat down on the creaking twin bed, and began the long, quiet work of figuring out who she was now that the last external structure of her previous life had been officially dissolved. The room was painted the yellow of institutional optimism. The window overlooked a neighbor's fence. The twin bed creaked every time she turned over in the night. Opal was kind. Opal's husband was tolerant. Their 3 teenage children were mostly indifferent to Fern's presence, which was in its own way a mercy. But the room felt like evidence, like a photograph where the woman in the frame was someone she no longer recognized and could not quite look away from. 4 months she lived in that room. 4 months of waking at 3 in the morning. 4 months of carrying a tin box at the bottom of her suitcase that she had not yet opened because she was not yet ready to receive what it contained. It was on a Thursday evening in late June while Opal's family watched television in the next room and Fern sat on the creaking twin bed with her knees pulled to her chest that she finally lifted the lid. She had known she needed to. That was the honest truth she had been circling for 4 months. She had known the day she signed the settlement papers. She had known the day she walked out of Birchwood Drive for the last time and heard the front door close behind her with a sound that felt permanent. She had known every single evening on this creaking bed. But knowing and being ready were 2 different things, and she had needed the 4 months between signing and opening to grieve enough of the old life that she could receive whatever the new one was trying to tell her. The tin box was small, faded green paint, vines on the lid worn almost smooth. Inside, nested in a square of folded fabric that smelled faintly of cedar, were 3 things. A small iron key, old enough that the metal had developed a deep charcoal patina, heavy and solid in a way that made it feel like it meant something. A folded piece of paper that turned out to be a property document. Unicoi County, East Tennessee. 5 acres, a cabin, a seasonal creek along the eastern boundary, and a letter in her grandmother's handwriting. The large looping cursive Lark had never bothered to modernize, written on the pale blue stationery she had used for every important piece of correspondence Fern had ever received from her. My Fern, it began without preamble because Lark had never been a woman who wasted time arriving at the point. If you are reading this on your wedding day, put it back in the box and save it for later. If you are reading this because something has gone wrong and you need to remember that you have somewhere to go, then listen carefully because I am only going to say this once and I need you to hear every word. You know the cabin. You spent summers there from the time you were 4 years old until you were 14 and decided you were too old for trips with your grandmother, which I forgave you for because 14 is difficult and I remembered what it felt like. You remember the porch and the creek and the way the light comes through the trees in the morning, like it has somewhere specific to be. You remember the smell of it. I know you do because you told me once when you were about 8 years old that the cabin smelled like the best version of everything. And I wrote that down in my journal because it was the truest thing I had ever heard a child say. Go there, Fern. Go there and stay as long as you need. Go there and remember who you were before you started making yourself smaller to fit inside someone else's life. You were whole before you met that man. I know because I watched you grow into yourself with my own eyes. And what I saw was a woman of extraordinary capability and absolute stubbornness and so much creative life that it practically radiated off you when you were working on something you loved. That woman did not disappear. She got buried. There is a difference, and the cabin is a good place to start digging. All my love always. Your grandmother, Lark. Fern read the letter 3 times without stopping. The first time, tears blurred the words so badly she had to blink repeatedly to keep them in focus. The second time she read it aloud in a whisper, barely audible hearing, Lark's voice in her own, as if the distance between them could be closed by breath and ink and the particular weight of words written by someone who had loved carefully enough to see 30 years into the future. The third time she read it in silence, and something shifted inside her. Not in her chest, not in her throat, but deeper than that, in the place where the ground itself lives. The way bedrock settles after something held under tremendous pressure for a very long time is finally quietly released. She set the letter down and picked up the property document. Unicoi County, 5 acres. The access road off the county route she could still hear in her memory. She had not been back since she was 14 years old. 44 years, more than 3/4 of her entire life. And yet, sitting on that creaking bed, she could close her eyes and walk every room of that cabin from memory. She held the key in both hands for a long time, feeling the weight of it, the realness of it. Her grandmother had known 30 years before the ending that there might be an ending, had tucked a door in a tin box inside a piece of fabric and told her to save it for when she needed it. Tomorrow morning, Fern decided with the quiet certainty of someone who has finally located solid ground beneath all the wreckage. She would tell Opal she was going on a trip. She would pack her suitcases. She would drive east into the mountains toward a cabin that had been waiting for her for 44 years. She did not know what she would find when she got there. She did not know if the roof still held or if the water still ran. She was 58 years old with no home, no income, no clear plan, and a heart that still felt bruised in places she had not yet had the courage to press. But she had a key. She had a deed. She had a grandmother's voice in faded blue cursive telling her that the woman she used to be was not gone, only buried, and that a cabin in the mountains was a good place to start digging. For the first time in 4 months, Fern Hargrove felt something other than hollowed out. It was small and fragile and not quite hope yet, but it was pointing in a direction. And for tonight, sitting on a creaking twin bed in a yellow room with an iron key growing warm in her hands, That was enough. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Fern woke before dawn on a Friday morning in late June and knew immediately that something fundamental had changed during the night. Not in the room, not in the house, in her. The tin box sat on the nightstand where she had left it, the iron key resting on top of the folded property document, and even in the gray light before sunrise, she could see its shape with a precision that had surprised her, as if her eyes had decided overnight to stop looking at things the way Sterling had trained them to, carefully and from a distance, and had returned to an older way of seeing, close, specific, unafraid. She sat up slowly. The house was deeply asleep around her. She could hear the particular silence of a family that would not stir for another hour, the refrigerator humming downstairs, the central air cycling, the absolute stillness of people who belonged exactly where they were sleeping. She had been a guest in that silence for 4 months. This morning she was something else. She was someone leaving. She moved to the small desk in the corner and opened her laptop and typed the address from the property document into a map. The screen loaded and there it was. The green of the national forest. The thin gray line of the county road winding upward. The small flag at the coordinates of 5 acres at the end of an unmarked access road approximately 4 miles from the nearest town. She leaned forward and studied the terrain and felt something in her stomach that she had to work to identify because it belonged to a version of her she had not heard from in years. It was hunger, not the kind you feed with food, the kind that moves you towards something. She packed in the quiet of early morning with the deliberate efficiency of someone who understood perhaps for the first time the difference between what was essential and what was merely accumulated. 2 suitcases, strategic choices, warm layers for mountain evenings, her medications, the hiking boots she had kept through the divorce for reasons she could not explain at the time but understood now. The 3 sketchbooks she had bought 2 months ago in a moment of irrational optimism and had not yet opened. She placed them in the second suitcase beside the small framed painting she had bought from a young artist at a street market in Knoxville the year the marriage started feeling like a room with no windows. The garbage bag of overflow clothing she left in the corner. The books she had been meaning to read she sorted and left with a note for Opal. She was not packing for a trip. She was deciding what to carry into the next version of her life, and the choosing felt like the first real decision she had made in a decade. At 6:30, she heard Opal moving in the kitchen. She went downstairs and found her sister making coffee with the automatic precision of a woman who had been running a household for 20 years without anyone noticing the labor of it. Opal looked at Fern's face, then at the car keys in her hand. She said nothing for a moment, which was one of the things Fern loved most about her sister. Opal had always understood that some moments required coffee before they required words. She poured 2 cups, set one in front of Fern, waited. "I am leaving today," Fern said. "I found out I own a piece of property. Grandma Lark left it to me years ago and I did not know. I am going there." Opal wrapped both hands around her mug, where mountains, East Tennessee, Unicoi County. "Are you okay?" The question carried the weight of 4 months. The weight of every evening Opal had listened through the wall to the creaking of a twin bed and the particular quality of silence that meant her sister was lying awake in the dark, doing the kind of math that never balances. "Not yet," Fern said, "but I will be better there than here." Opal's eyes reddened. She did not cry. Neither did Fern. They were Hargrove women, and Hargrove women did not cry when they were about to. They drank coffee instead. They sat across from each other in a kitchen that smelled like the automatic drip and the last of somebody's cereal, and they let the silence say what it needed to say. Fern pulled out of Opal's driveway at 7:45 on a Friday morning, with the sun already warming the air and the tin box on the passenger seat beside her. She did not cry when she left Clover Hill behind. She had spent 4 months doing that kind of work in the Yellow Room, and she was finished with it now. What she felt instead as she drove east was something she recognized the way you recognize a face you have not seen since childhood. Anticipation, clean and uncomplicated and pointed in a single direction, entirely her own. The drive from Clover Hill to Unicoi County took just under 3 hours on a clear Friday morning, and Fern spent most of it in a silence that had nothing in common with the silence of the borrowed bedroom. That silence had been the silence of waiting. This was the silence of someone paying attention, watching through the windshield as the ground began to rise, and the tree lines thickened, and the sky changed quality in a way that was difficult to name, but impossible to miss once you saw it. The blue deepened, the light sharpened, the horizon grew complicated with the layered shapes of mountains, revealing themselves the way mountains always do, first as suggestion, then as presence, then as something so immediate that you stop trying to find words for it and simply drive toward it with both hands on the wheel. She stopped at a small grocery in a town called Limestone and spent 40 minutes moving through the aisles with the focused intention of someone provisioning for a life she had not yet seen but had already decided to build. Rice, pasta, canned goods, olive oil, coffee in a quantity that made the woman behind the register raise an eyebrow, fresh produce for the first week, cleaning supplies, a new notepad and 3 pens, a small battery-powered lantern. The woman behind the register was in her mid-60s, silver hair pulled into a high bun, wearing a flannel shirt that had been washed so many times it had achieved the particular softness that only comes from years of actual use. Her name tag said Corinne. She was ringing up the lantern when she glanced at the property document Fern had left on the counter beside her wallet. County Road 1147. Corinne said, not as a question, up past the bridge. Only one place up there, Lark Whitfield's cabin. Fern stood very still. You knew my grandmother. Corinne looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that takes in more than a face. Everybody around here knew Lark, she said. She lived up there by herself for 4 years before she met your grandfather. Completely alone. Nobody thought a woman could do that in those days. She paused, then added, most people still do not think a woman can do that. Fern thanked her and carried the groceries to the car and sat in the parking lot for a moment with her hands on the steering wheel, turning over a piece of information she had never possessed. Lark had lived alone on that mountain for 4 years, before Fern's grandfather, before the marriage Fern had always assumed was the beginning of Lark's story. There had been a chapter before the chapter she knew, and Corinne's words sat in her mind like a door she had not yet opened. She drove on. The county road narrowed and climbed, and the gravel started, and the trees closed overhead, and the sound of the tires changed to that particular popping rhythm she had not heard in 44 years, but recognized instantly the way you recognize a song you learn as a child. The small wooden bridge over the narrowest part of the creek appeared around a bend. She crossed it and smelled the specific combination of pine and mountain water that existed nowhere else on earth, and felt her throat tighten, not with sadness, but with the particular ache of returning to a place your body remembers, even when your mind has tried to forget. The clearing in front of the cabin was overgrown. Tall grass and volunteer shrubs had colonized the open ground. The porch railing had a length missing on the right side. One shutter hung at a slight angle. The roof looked intact. The whole structure had the appearance not of something declining, but of something conserving itself, waiting with the patience of a thing that knew its vacancy was temporary. Fern turned off the engine and sat in the sudden quiet. The forest moved in to fill it immediately. Birds she could not name, wind through high branches, the continuous murmur of the creek somewhere below the tree line to her right. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the cabin through the windshield and felt the full weight of 44 years pressing against the glass between then and now. She picked up the iron key from the passenger seat and got out of the car. The air was immediate, cool and layered and carrying the creek in the pollen and the particular mineral smell of mountain soil after recent rain. She stood beside the car and breathed it in the way her body knew how to do, deeply and deliberately locating herself in the physical reality of where she actually was. She walked to the porch steps, tested the first one with her weight, solid, climbed to the front door. The lock was stiff, the key turned after a moment of firm pressure. The door swung inward on hinges that groaned long and low, and the sound traveled through Fern's body the way certain sounds do when they carry more meaning than physics can account for. She stepped inside and stood in the doorway while her eyes adjusted. And when they did, she pressed one hand flat against the door frame because the cabin was exactly as she remembered it. The low ceilings, the stone fireplace with the iron grate from the antique market in Asheville, the narrow staircase to the sleeping loft, the kitchen through the doorway to the left with its south-facing window and the old wooden table Lark had used for everything. She set the key on the table by the door and walked slowly into the center of the main room and stood in the dusty filtered light and cried, quietly, thoroughly, for everything that had been taken and everything that had survived and everything that was still entirely unknown. She let the mountains hold her while she did, and they held her well, because that is what mountains do when you finally stop running long enough to let them. She gave herself 1 hour, then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and stood up and got to work. She opened every window, first front to back, and the mountain air moved through the rooms and the cabin seemed to release a breath it had been holding for years. She found the maintenance folder in the kitchen drawer, exactly where Lark's letter said it would be. Records going back to 2008, a list of local contractors, utility account numbers, the name and phone number of a property manager in Irwin named Garrett Blackwell, described in Lark's handwriting as honest, capable, and not prone to overcomplicating simple problems. She started cleaning and did not stop for 3 days. Sweeping, scrubbing, washing windows inside and out, working in a rhythm that belonged to her body rather than a schedule, slow and deliberate, the pace of someone relearning how to exist inside time without an external clock telling her where to be and when. The south-facing kitchen window, once cleaned of years of grime and cobwebs, flooded the room with afternoon light in a way that made Fern stop mid-motion and stand perfectly still with the rag in her hand. It was the same quality of light she had chosen the Birchwood Drive house for. The same warmth, the same angle, the same way it found the surfaces in a room and made them look like they mattered. She had always been drawn to the same things, had always known instinctively what a space needed to feel alive. That knowledge had not been given to her by Sterling or produced by the marriage. It had been hers before any of that. It was still hers now. On the second morning, she knelt beneath the kitchen sink to check a pipe and found a wooden toolbox pushed against the back aisle. She pulled it out and opened it, and inside were Lark's tools. A set of wrenches, 2 screwdrivers, a small hammer, pliers, a roll of plumber's tape, and taped to the inside of the lid a piece of paper in Lark's handwriting. A list of common repairs with instructions. Kitchen faucet, 3/4-inch wrench, turn counterclockwise. Do not use too much force. Patience over efficiency. Fern read the note 3 times. Then she picked up the 3/4-inch wrench and crawled under the sink and found the dripping joint Lark had apparently anticipated and tightened it with careful, patient turns until the drip stopped. She turned on the faucet. Water ran clear and cold from the tap. She held her hands under it and watched it flow between her fingers and stood there longer than she needed to, not because the water required watching, but because the act of fixing something with her own hands using tools left by a woman who had trusted her to figure it out produced a feeling she did not have a single word for. Something between competence and inheritance. Something that tasted like the beginning of believing in herself again. She called Garrett Blackwell on the second day. He arrived the following morning in a pickup truck that had seen enough weather to have its own personality. He was 67, with hands that knew their way around a problem and eyes that assessed the cabin with the respectful efficiency of someone who had been solving rural property issues for 3 decades. He checked the roof. Sound, the foundation, solid. He arranged a propane delivery for that afternoon and fixed the detached porch railing in 40 minutes with tools from the bed of his truck without being asked. Before he left, he stood on the porch looking out at the ridge and said something that stopped Fern mid-step. "Your grandmother replaced the roof on this cabin herself when she was 74. Hired the crew, sure. But she climbed up there and inspected every panel personally. She told me once, if you do not know what your own roof looks like, you do not really own the place." Fern filed that away beside Corinne's words. Two people who had known Lark. Two pieces of a woman she thought she had understood completely and was beginning to realize she had only known in part. On the fourth morning, she discovered something else. Walking the eastern boundary of the property along the creek, she noticed a series of shallow stone channels cut into the slope above the cabin. She followed them uphill and found a complete rainwater drainage system, hand-designed using the natural grade of the terrain to direct runoff away from the foundation and into the creek. It was simple, it was elegant, and it had been functioning perfectly for what appeared to be decades without any maintenance whatsoever. She went back inside and opened one of the 3 sketchbooks and drew the drainage system in precise technical detail. Cross-sections, flow patterns, measurements she paced off with her boots. It was the first technical drawing she had made since she stopped taking design clients 13 years ago, and her hand remembered the discipline of it the way a musician's fingers remember scales. The lines were clean, the proportions were accurate, and when she finished, she sat on the porch steps and looked at the drawing and understood that this skill, this specific ability to see how things fit together and make them visible on paper, had been inside her the entire time Sterling was using it without crediting her, and she was letting him. That afternoon, she opened the second sketchbook, sat on the porch with a pencil, held it over the paper, and waited to see what her hand wanted to do. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, without any conscious direction, she began to draw the tree line. Not carefully, not technically, loosely the way she had drawn as a child before anyone taught her what drawing was supposed to look like. The pencil moved and the trees appeared, and then the ridge above them, and then the morning light through the upper branches. Her first stroke was hesitant. Her second was not. By the time she stopped, the page was full and her hand was steady, and something that had been locked inside her for 11 years had opened not dramatically, but irreversibly, the way a frozen river opens in March. Not all at once, but in the places that matter first. By the end of the second week, she had filled 40 pages. Garrett introduced her to Sutton Winfield on the 9th day. Sutton was a carpenter from Irwin 46 who worked with wood the way some people work with language, precisely and without unnecessary decoration. He came to assess the staircase to the sleeping loft, where 3 steps had gone soft with moisture damage over the years. He worked quietly, measuring and cutting, and finished the repair in a single day. Before he left, he stood on the porch the way Garrett had, looking at the ridge. Your grandmother used to say this cabin is not a place to hide. It is a place to find your way back. He glanced at Fern. She said a lot of things like that. Most of them turned out to be right. Fern watched him drive down the gravel road and added his words to the growing collection of evidence that Lark had left a legacy in this community that went far beyond property lines and maintenance records. She had left an impression, the kind that lasts because it was earned rather than performed. The third week settled into a rhythm that felt like the first honest structure Fern had built since her 20s. Early mornings on the porch, regardless of weather, physical work through the morning, drawing in the afternoons, evenings reading by the light of the lantern she had bought at Corinne's store, because even though the electricity worked, the lantern light was softer and reminded her of the summers when Lark would read aloud to her after dinner, while the moths circled the porch light and the creek murmured below. She was on the porch on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after she arrived with her second cup of coffee and a half-finished drawing of the creek stones she had photographed the previous afternoon when she heard two car doors close at the bottom of the clearing. Not one, two. She looked up and felt the morning rearrange itself around her. Opal's silver sedan was parked at the edge of the clearing. Behind it, a black SUV she recognized the way you recognize a sound you have been dreading without admitting it. Sterling's company vehicle. Oversized for any practical purpose. Chosen to communicate something about the man who drove it rather than to serve any function the man actually needed. She set her coffee cup on the railing, closed her sketchbook, stood up slowly, registered with quiet satisfaction that the primary sensation moving through her body was not fear. It was readiness. Opal came up the porch steps first. Her face carried the expression of someone experiencing relief and guilt simultaneously, which told Fern everything about how this visit had been organized. Sterling crossed the clearing in city shoes, stepping through the tall grass with the measured stride of a man who considered his arrival anywhere a reasonable and expected event. He stopped at the base of the porch steps. "Fern, you look well." She did not say thank you. She looked at Opal, who stood slightly behind Sterling, with her arms crossed, her face communicating apology and helplessness in equal measure. Fern held her sister's eyes for a moment. Then she released them because Opal had always been someone who tried to repair things, and this was Opal trying to repair something, and Fern could either be angry about the method or deal with the situation it had produced. She chose the second. "You should have called," Fern said. "I tried calling," Sterling said, and moved to come up the steps. Fern did not step aside. She stayed where she was in the center of the porch, and the simple act of standing still created something between them that had never existed in 30 years of marriage. A boundary that required no explanation. Sterling stopped on the second step. His eyes were level with hers instead of above them. She could see the small recalibration in his expression, the adjustment of a man who had expected the version of Fern he remembered and was meeting a different one. "This is not practical, Fern," he said, gesturing at the cabin and the clearing and the mountains beyond. "You cannot seriously intend to stay here." "Live," Fern said. The word came out with a simplicity that needed nothing added to it. "Live on what? Doing what? Up here, painting pictures." "Yes," Fern said, "painting pictures." His eyes moved past her to the cabin interior visible through the open door. She watched his gaze travel across the room the way she had watched it travel across properties for 30 years. He was not looking at her home. He was assessing an asset. And then he said the words she had been half expecting since the moment she saw his vehicle in the clearing. "Fern, I need to be straightforward with you. This property may fall within the scope of our shared marital assets. We need to review the documentation before anything is settled." This property was given to me by my grandmother 2 years before we were married, Sterling. The paperwork is clear. She held his eyes. No anxious monitoring. No scanning his expression for displeasure. No calibrating her response to minimize friction. She looked at him and waited, and what she saw in his face after a moment was something she had never seen directed at her in 3 decades. Not anger, not impatience. Something closer to the expression of a man standing on ground he assumed was solid and feeling it shift. At that moment, the sound of tires on gravel came from the access road. A pickup truck appeared at the edge of the clearing. Sutton Winfield, who had arranged to come back that morning to repair a damaged window shutter. He saw the unfamiliar vehicles and pulled to the far side of the clearing and cut his engine, but did not get out. He sat in his truck and waited with the particular patience of a man who understood that some situations resolve themselves better without additional people in them. Sterling looked at Sutton's truck, looked back at Fern. Something colder moved across his face, something possessive and calculating that had nothing to do with concern for her well-being and everything to do with control over things he considered his, including Fern, realized with a clarity that felt almost peaceful her. She turned to Opal. "Come inside, I will make coffee." Opal came up the steps, immediately touching Fern's arm as she passed with a pressure that said sorry, and I love you without sound. Sterling remained on the second step a moment longer. Then he came up and followed them inside. And Fern let him in because he was no longer someone whose presence in a room changed the shape of her breathing, and because some conversations needed to happen inside a space that belonged to her in order for them to end the way they needed to end. 3 cups of coffee on the kitchen table. Sterling sat across from Fern. Opal sat between them, her hands wrapped around her mug, saying nothing. The afternoon light fell across the table in the same pattern it had fallen in for decades, illuminating the wood grain and the coffee steam and the faces of 3 people who each understood that what happened in the next few minutes would determine something permanent. "I did not come here to cause trouble," Sterling said. "I came because I am concerned about you." Fern looked at him across the table her grandmother had used for everything from jigsaw puzzles to important letters. "No," she said, "you did not. It was not an accusation. It was a correction. Delivered without heat, without bitterness, with the flat precision of someone stating a measurement." Sterling opened his mouth and then closed it. And in the silence that followed, something seemed to move behind his eyes, as if a door he had kept locked for a long time was being tested from the inside. "I know I was not fair," he said quietly, "with everything." Fern accepted this the way you accept a payment that arrives years late and covers only a fraction of the debt. She did not expand it into something larger. She did not offer forgiveness or withhold it. She simply received it as a fact, noted its insufficiency, and set it down. When Sterling left an hour later, driving back down the gravel road, Fern stood on the porch and watched him go. But she felt no relief, because she had seen something during that hour that Opal had missed. The way Sterling's eyes returned again and again to the clearing. The tree lined the acreage visible from the kitchen window. He had not been looking at her home. He had been measuring something, and the question he had raised about shared marital assets had not been a bluff. It had been a ranging shot. Opal stayed for dinner. They sat on the porch as the sun went down and drank wine from mismatched glasses found in the kitchen cabinet and talked the way they had talked when they were young. "You seem different," Opal said at one point. "I think I am becoming myself again," Fern said. Opal raised her glass and said nothing else. But after Opal left the next morning, Fern sat on the porch with her coffee and replayed the visit and could not shake the feeling that had lodged itself in her stomach like a splinter. Sterling had come to see the land. He had come because someone had told him where she was, and he had come to see what she had, And the look on his face when he surveyed those 5 acres had been the look she had watched him wear 1,000 times before standing in the driveways of properties he intended to acquire. She did not know yet who had told him. She did not know what he planned to do next. But she knew Sterling Redmond. She had spent 30 years studying him the way a person studies weather, when their survival depends on reading the sky accurately. And the sky she had read on his face during that visit was not clearing. It was building towards something. Fern set down her coffee, picked up her sketchbook, drew 3 lines on the page before her hand stopped moving. Because for the first time since she had turned that iron key in the lock and stepped into her grandmother's cabin, she was not sure the ground she was standing on would remain hers. To understand what happened next, you need to understand how information travels in a small town, not through newspapers or social media or any deliberate act of communication. It travels the way water moves through limestone, finding every crack, following every channel, arriving in places nobody intended it to reach. Calla Dunmore was the wife of Lawson Dunmore, the attorney who had represented Sterling in the divorce. She was 60 years old, well-connected in the social circles Fern had once moved through, and she possessed the particular talent of some people for delivering damaging information while maintaining the appearance of innocent conversation. At a dinner party in Clover Lake 3 weeks after Sterling's visit to the cabin, Calla mentioned to a mutual acquaintance in a voice calibrated to carry exactly far enough that Fern Hargrove was apparently living in some old family cabin up in Unicoi County. Roughing it, Calla said with the kind of smile that turns concern into commentary. The information reached Sterling within 48 hours, and Sterling, who had dismissed that property as a shack on a mountain when he had deliberately excluded it from the divorce proceedings, did something he had not done before. He looked up the current land values in Unicoi County. What he found changed the temperature of his interest considerably. The area had been identified in a regional development study as a priority zone for ecotourism investment. Property values along the ridgeline had increased substantially in the past 5 years. The 5 acres Lark Whitfield had purchased decades ago for almost nothing were now worth a figure that made Sterling Redmond sit very still at his desk for a long time. 2 weeks after his visit to the cabin, Fern walked down to the mailbox Garrett Blackwell had helped her install at the junction of the access road in the county route. Among the utility notices and a seed catalog she had ordered was a white envelope with the return address of a law firm she recognized, Lawson Dunmore and Associates. She opened it, standing at the mailbox. The letter was 2 pages written in the precise, emotionless language of legal correspondence. It stated that Sterling Redmond's legal counsel had reason to believe the property in Unicoi County might constitute a marital asset subject to equitable distribution under Tennessee law. It requested that Fern provide original documentation proving the property was a premarital gift. Failure to respond within 30 days would result in a formal petition to the court. Fern read the letter twice. Her hands did not shake. What moved through her was not the familiar cold dread of the divorce proceedings. It was something hotter and cleaner. Anger, but not the kind she had spent 30 years swallowing. This anger had edges. It knew its own name. And it was pointed at a man who had taken her house, her career, her confidence, and was now reaching for the last thing her grandmother had left her. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope and walked back up the gravel road to the cabin. She sat at the kitchen table and called Merritt Bancroft. Merritt listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, then spoke with the careful precision of a man who understood the difference between what the law could do and what it should do. Mrs. Whitfield, if you have original documentation proving this was a gift made to you personally before the marriage, they have no case. A premarital gift properly documented is separate property under Tennessee law. But I need the original paperwork, not a copy, the original, with a notarized signature and a date that predates the marriage certificate. Fern looked at the property document from the tin box. Lark's handwriting, faded ink, no notary seal, no official stamp, just a grandmother's careful cursive describing a piece of land and a cabin and the intention to pass it to her granddaughter. The document I have may not be sufficient, she said. Then we need to find something, that is, Merritt replied. Because without it, Marsh will file, and even if we win eventually, the process will take months and cost money you do not have to spend. Fern thanked him and hung up and sat at the kitchen table in the cabin. Her grandmother had left her looking at a legal letter that was trying to take it away, and felt the full weight of the situation settle onto her shoulders with the familiar heaviness of a fight she had not chosen and could not afford to lose. 3 days later, on a Wednesday morning, she heard tires on the access road and walked to the porch expecting Garrett or Sutton. Instead, a white sedan she did not recognize pulled into the clearing. A man in khakis and a polo shirt got out carrying a clipboard and a measuring tape. He was mid-50s with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to going where he was sent without asking too many questions about why. He was halfway across the clearing before Fern stepped off the porch and met him at the edge of the grass. "Can I help you?" she said. It was not a question. The man looked at his clipboard. "Wyatt Thornton," he said. "I am here to do a property assessment, ordered by the owner's legal representative." Fern felt something lock into place inside her. The same mechanism that had kept her standing on the porch when Sterling tried to come up the steps. The same refusal to step aside. "I am the owner," she said, "and I did not order an assessment. You are on private property without my permission, Mr. Thornton. I am going to need you to leave." Thornton looked at her, looked at the cabin, looked back at his clipboard as if it might contain instructions for this particular situation. It did not. "Ma'am, I was told the property ownership was under review." "It is not under review," Fern said. "It is mine, and you are trespassing. Please leave now." Thornton stood there for a moment longer, caught between the authority of whoever had sent him and the authority of the woman standing 4 feet away from him, with an expression that made it clear she was not going to explain herself twice. He chose the simpler path. He got back in his car and drove down the gravel road, and Fern watched him go with her arms at her sides and her feet planted on the ground that Lark Whitfield had bought and maintained and protected for decades for exactly this purpose. She went inside and called Merritt Bancroft again. Merritt's voice was sharper this time. "They sent someone to your property without notice or consent. That changes things. I can file a trespass complaint and use it as leverage, but Fern, I need that documentation. Without proof of premarital gift, we are fighting this with one hand tied." That evening, Fern sat in the sleeping loft in the room where she had spent 10 summers as a child and thought about Lark. Not the Lark of the letter whose words she had memorized. Not the Lark of the maintenance folder whose practical intelligence had kept this cabin standing for decades. She thought about the Lark that Corinne and Garrett and Sutton had described. A woman who had lived alone on this mountain for 4 years. A woman who had replaced her own roof at 74. A woman who had built something with her hands and held onto it with her will and made sure decades in advance that her granddaughter would have a place to stand when the ground gave way. And she thought about the floorboard. She crawled to the corner nearest the north wall, the third board from the edge. She pressed it with her palm and felt it give slightly the way it had given when she was 8 years old. And Lark had said those words she had carried for 50 years without understanding them. She worked her fingers under the edge and lifted. Beneath the board, set into a shallow space that had been deliberately cut into the joist below, was a second tin box, smaller than the first, same faded green paint. Same vine pattern on the lid worn smooth by hands that were no longer alive, but whose care was still, even now, still protecting her. Fern lifted it out and sat cross-legged on the floor of the sleeping loft and opened it. Inside were two things. The first was a notarized copy of a gift deed dated 2 years before Fern's marriage. It bore Lark's signature, Fern's full legal name as recipient, a detailed property description matching the Unicoi County parcel, and the stamp and signature of a notary public in Irwin, Tennessee. It was clear, it was unambiguous. It was exactly the document Merritt Bancroft needed. The second was a leather-bound journal, small enough to fit in a coat pocket, filled cover to cover with Lark's handwriting. Fern held both objects in her lap and sat in the dark of the sleeping loft and laughed. Not loudly, not hysterically, quietly and with a depth of gratitude that went beyond anything she had words for. Because her grandmother had not just prepared for the possibility that Fern might need a place to go, she had prepared for the possibility that someone might try to take it away from her. She had hidden the proof in the one place she knew Fern would eventually look, beneath a loose board she had told an 8-year-old girl was holding a place for something. She sent the notarized deed to Merritt Bancroft the next morning by overnight mail. Merritt called her that afternoon. "This is everything we need," he said. "I am sending it to Marsh today with a response letter. And Fern, I am including a note suggesting that if his client pursues this further, we will consider filing a counterclaim for harassment and abusive process. This ends now." Lawson Dunmore withdrew his client's claim within 1 week. No hearing, no petition, no further correspondence. The legal threat that had kept Fern awake for 5 nights dissolved as cleanly as if it had never existed. But it had existed, and the fact that Sterling had initiated it, that he had sent a stranger onto her land to measure what he hoped to take, told Fern everything she still needed to know about the man she had been married to and the distance she had traveled from the woman who would have led him. The same week the legal threat collapsed, Petra Redmond called Opal. Fern learned about the call on a Saturday evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the journal she had not yet opened. Opal's voice on the phone was tight in a way Fern recognized as her sister, trying to manage 2 loyalties at once and failing at both. "Petra says you are embarrassing," Sterling, Opal said. "She says the whole situation is making him look bad professionally. People are talking. She thinks you should come back to Clover Hill and stop making things difficult." Fern listened to her sister relay the words of a woman who had told her at a dinner table 15 years ago that she should be grateful for a life she could never have built for herself. She waited until Opal finished. "Opal," she said, "you do not need to apologize for listening to Petra, but you need to stop repeating her words to me as though they carry weight. They do not. Sterling is embarrassed because he tried to take something that was not his and failed. That is not my problem. It is not yours either." The line was quiet for a long time. Then Opal said in a voice that was smaller and more honest than the one she had been using, "You are right. I am sorry. I should not have called with this." "You can call me with anything," Fern said, "just not with Petra's voice." They talked for another 20 minutes about nothing important, and when they hung up, Fern sat with the phone in her hand and acknowledged something she had not allowed herself to feel during the legal threat or the confrontation with Thornton or any of the difficult moments of the past weeks. She was tired, not the exhaustion of someone who has been defeated, the tiredness of someone who has been fighting and winning and would very much like to stop fighting and start building instead. She opened Lark's journal. She read it over the course of 3 evenings, sitting at the kitchen table by lantern light, turning the pages slowly, letting her grandmother's voice fill the room, the way it had filled the cabin porch during those childhood summers. The journal was not a diary in the conventional sense. It was not organized by date or structured around daily events. It was more like a conversation Lark had been having with herself across decades, returning to the same pages, adding thoughts in different colored inks, building a record of a life that Fern had only ever seen from the outside. And what Fern found in those pages was the story Corinne had hinted at in the grocery store. Before Fern's grandfather, there had been a man named Harold. Lark had married Harold when she was 22 years old. The marriage lasted 10 years. Lark's account of those years was not dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was precise. Harold never told me I was stupid. Lark had written in blue ink that had faded to the color of a winter sky. He simply explained everything to me with the patience of someone speaking to a child. And after 10 years, I began to believe I was one. I forgot that I had once been a woman who could build a fence and balance a checkbook and drive a truck through a mountain pass in February without asking anyone's permission or needing anyone's help. Harold did not take those abilities from me. He made me forget I had them. And forgetting felt from the inside exactly like losing. Lark left Harold. It was not dramatic. She did not leave in anger or in the heat of an argument. She left on a Tuesday morning in April while Harold was at work with one suitcase and a savings account he had never known about because he had never imagined she was capable of planning something he had not approved. She drove east without telling anyone where she was going because there was no one to tell. Harold had made sure of that gradually over 10 years, the way a vine grows over a window until the light stops coming through. She bought the 5 acres in Unicoi County with that savings. She built the cabin. Not alone, she hired help, but she was there every day making decisions, learning the land, discovering what she was capable of when nobody was standing beside her, explaining why she was not capable of it. 4 years, Lark wrote. 4 years of silence and hard work and mornings on this porch, watching the mist move through the trees and remembering one piece at a time who I was before I married a man who needed me to be less than him in order to feel like enough. Those 4 years did not make me a different person. They returned me to myself. Fern closed the journal and sat at the kitchen table in the cabin her grandmother had built after leaving her own difficult marriage, and felt the weight of inheritance settle around her shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with property or legal documents. Lark had not just left her a cabin. She had left her a precedent, a roadmap drawn by someone who had walked the same path 50 years earlier and survived it and come out the other side as someone stronger and more completely herself than the woman who had entered the marriage. Fern thought about the Lark she had known as a child, the woman on the porch who taught her to see, the woman who made breakfast slowly and deliberately and never seemed hurried by anything, the woman who had pressed a tin box into her hands at a wedding and said, "Keep this where only you can find it." That Lark had not been a woman who had always been whole. She had been a woman who had been broken and had rebuilt herself with the same patience and stubbornness she had brought to everything else, one day at a time, one repair at a time, one morning on the porch at a time. The knowledge settled into Fern with the weight of something she would carry for the rest of her life. Some women need to go to the mountains to remember who they are, and the mountains will wait as long as necessary. The sketchbooks gave way in the 6th week to larger work. Fern ordered canvas and paint through the mail, and Sutton helped her build simple wooden frames in the cabin's main room, which she converted into a studio by pushing the furniture against the walls and setting up her materials in the center, where the light from the south-facing window was strongest. She painted with a freedom she had not felt since her early 20s before Sterling, before the slow constriction of her creative life into the narrow channel of supporting someone else's ambitions. The work was informed by the landscape but not limited to it. She painted the ridge line and the creek and the particular quality of mountain light at different hours, but underneath the surface of every painting, visible only to someone who looked carefully, was something more personal. shapes that suggested doors and windows and thresholds, the recurring image of a passageway between one kind of space and another. She sent photographs of 3 paintings to a former colleague who ran a small gallery in Knoxville. She sent them without expectation, the way you throw a line into water without knowing what is underneath. The colleague called back within 2 hours. "When can I see the rest of them?" Fern sat on the porch steps with the phone pressed to her ear and felt her eyes fill and her throat close, and she waited a full minute before answering because she needed to be certain her voice would hold. "February," she said. "I will have enough for a show by February." She hung up and sat on the steps and pressed her palms flat against the wood her grandmother had maintained for decades and let the reality of what had just happened settle into her body the way rain settles into dry ground. Not all at once, but completely. She had a showing scheduled. She had work that someone who understood art had looked at and wanted to see more of. She had a direction, and the direction led forward, and for the first time since the divorce, forward felt like a place she actually wanted to go. Corinne Aldrich stopped by the cabin one afternoon with a basket of cornbread and a jar of sourwood honey from a beekeeper she knew 2 ridges over. She stood in the doorway and looked at the paintings leaning against the walls and was quiet for a long time, in the way people are quiet when they are seeing something they did not expect. "Your grandmother would have liked these," Corinne said finally. "She always told me her granddaughter had something special in her hands." I did not know what she meant until right now. Fern felt warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the compliment and everything to do with the realization that Lark was still reaching across the years through the voices of people she had left behind in this community. People who remembered her not because she had performed the role of someone worth remembering, but because she had been herself consistently until the impression became permanent. Sutton came by twice more that month to help with smaller repairs, a cabinet door that would not close a section of the porch floor that needed reinforcing before winter. He worked without unnecessary conversation and left without ceremony. But on his last visit, he paused at the edge of the clearing and turned back. "You know, most people who come up here are running from something. You are the first one I have seen who looks like she is running toward it." It was a Thursday evening in early September when she heard the sound of a single vehicle on the gravel road. Not Garrett's truck, which she knew by the particular rattle of his tailgate. Not Sutton's, which announced itself with a loose muffler he kept promising to fix. This engine was quieter and heavier, and Fern recognized it before the vehicle appeared around the last bend in the access road. Sterling's black SUV pulled into the clearing and stopped. One door opened, one man got out. He was alone this time. No Opal, no attorney. He was wearing boots instead of city shoes. Old ones that looked borrowed, and he carried a single envelope in his right hand. He looked different from the man who had stood at the base of her porch steps 5 weeks earlier. Older, or maybe just tired in a way that he had not been willing to show before, when the performance of competence was still more important to him than the admission of its limits. He walked to the porch and stopped at the bottom step and looked up at Fern, who was standing at the railing with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands. "I am not here about the property," he said. His voice was lower than she remembered, quieter, stripped of the professional modulation she had listened to for 3 decades. "Lawson told me we have no case. I know that. I am not here for that." Fern waited. Sterling held up the envelope. "This is a withdrawal, a signed statement that I have no claim on this property and will not pursue one. My attorney prepared it. I need you to sign a corresponding statement that you will not file a counterclaim against me for the assessment incident or the initial filing." He paused. "It is affecting my business. Clients have heard. In real estate, reputation is everything, and a man who sued his ex-wife for her grandmother's cabin is not a man people want to do business with." Fern looked at the envelope, then at Sterling, and she understood with the calm clarity of someone who has spent 3 decades learning to read a man's face that he was telling the truth. He was not here because he was sorry. He was here because the consequences of his actions had arrived at a place he cared about his professional reputation, and he needed them to stop. She could have signed the paper and sent him away. It would have been clean and efficient, and it would have ended everything with the minimum amount of further interaction. Part of her wanted exactly that. But another part of her, the part that had been slowly, painstakingly excavating itself from 30 years of silence, that part wanted something Sterling had never given her in the entire history of their marriage. Not an apology, not money, not the house on Birchwood Drive. Something smaller and larger than all of those things. "I will sign your paper," she said, "on one condition." Sterling looked at her with the expression of a man who was accustomed to negotiating and was not prepared to negotiate with this particular person. "You are going to write something for me," Fern said, "not typed, not drafted by your attorney, written by hand in your own words. A statement acknowledging what I contributed to your business during the 10 years I managed it. Not for legal purposes, not for publication, just for me. So that somewhere in the world there is a piece of paper with your handwriting on it that says I existed in the work you built your name on." The clearing was very quiet, wind through the high pines, the creek below the tree line, a bird she had learned to identify over the past weeks as a wood thrush singing its spiraling song from somewhere in the canopy. Sterling looked at her for a long time, then he nodded once. Fern went inside and brought out a pen and a pad of paper. Not legal paper, not letterhead, the same notepad she used for grocery lists and cabin repair notes. She set them on the porch railing. Sterling sat down on the top step, and Fern watched him pick up the pen and hold it over the paper for a long time before he began to write. She had seen him sign contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars without hesitation. She had watched him draft emails and proposals and presentations with the fluid confidence of a man who never doubted that his words carried authority. But this was different. This required him to find language for something he had never had to name, and the difficulty of it was visible in his posture, in the way his hand moved slowly across the page in the 20 minutes it took him to fill both sides of a single sheet. When he finished, he held it out to her. She took it and read it standing on the porch while he sat on the steps below her. It was not perfect. It was not complete. It was written in the cautious, qualified language of a man who had spent his whole life protecting himself from the implications of his own words. But it was real. It named specific things she had done. It acknowledged contributions he had claimed as his own. And at the bottom, in handwriting that was less controlled than the rest, he had written a single sentence that Fern read 3 times. "I should have said this a long time ago." She folded the paper and put it in her pocket. Then she signed his withdrawal document and handed it back to him. Sterling stood up. He stood on the porch of a cabin he had once called a shack and looked out at the clearing Fern had spent weeks reclaiming from the overgrowth and the ridge beyond, it turning gold in the late afternoon light. "You built something here," he said quietly. It was the first time in 30 years that he had looked at something Fern had made and described it accurately. He walked to his vehicle and got in and drove down the gravel road, and Fern stood on the porch and watched the dust settle behind him and felt something she had no interest in naming, because names would have made it smaller than it was. It was not forgiveness, and it was not closure, and it was not any of the words people use to describe the end of a painful chapter. It was completion, the sound of a door finally closing all the way after years of being almost but not quite shut. She took the folded paper from her pocket and read it one more time. His handwriting had always been neat, almost architectural, but in this letter it was looser, less controlled, as if the pen had been moving faster than his ability to manage the impression it made. He had written about the marketing materials she designed, about the client dinners she organized, about the filing system she built that his entire office still used, about the presentation she created for the Thornton deal, the one that had landed his largest commission, the one he had presented as his own work to a room full of investors while she sat in the audience and smiled. He had written all of it, and it did not undo anything. It did not give her back the years or the studio or the house on Birchwood Drive. But it placed on paper in his own handwriting the fact that she had existed inside the work he had built his reputation on. And sometimes the smallest acts of recognition, the ones that arrive too late and cover too little, are the ones that matter most. Not because they are sufficient, but because they are real. October arrived in the mountains the way October always does in East Tennessee, with the slow, spectacular patience of a season that knows it is the most beautiful one and sees no reason to rush. The ridge went gold first, then amber, then a deep arterial red that intensified throughout the afternoons until the landscape appeared to be lit from within. Fern sat on the porch in the early morning light with her coffee and her sketchbook in the particular unhurried quality of a woman who had recently arrived at a place she intended to stay. Not just the cabin, herself. 3 months since she had turned the key. 3 months of work and rest and mornings when the weight of everything she had lost arrived without warning, and she sat with it until it passed because she had learned that grief does not ask permission and does not respond to schedules, and the only honest thing to do with it is let it move through you at its own pace and trust that it will not stay forever. She had found a rhythm that belonged entirely to her. Early mornings on the porch, regardless of weather, physical work through the morning, the cabin and the property, providing an endless supply of purposeful tasks. She had cleared the overgrowth from the front clearing with a hand scythe she found in Lark's tool shed, working for an hour each morning until the original boundaries of the space were visible again. She had repainted the window shutters a deep green that matched the forest behind the cabin. She had repaired the stone border along the garden path that led down to the creek, carrying rocks from the creek bed, one at a time, fitting them into place with the patient attention of someone who understood that building something with your hands is its own form of thinking. She was not lonely. That was perhaps the most surprising discovery of the 3 months. She had learned the difference between solitude and loneliness in a way that no amount of reading or therapy could have taught her. Loneliness was what she had felt at dinner parties on Birchwood Drive, surrounded by people but entirely absent from her own life. Solitude was what she felt on the porch at dawn, with the mountains turning gold and the coffee warm in her hands. One was full, the other had been empty. She had spent 30 years confusing the two. She had filled sketchbook after sketchbook. She had completed 9 paintings, each one less guarded than the last, each one reaching further into the territory she had been afraid to enter, for 30 years the territory of her own unedited vision. She had identified the south-facing slope for a garden come spring, and ordered the seed catalogs and spent evenings reading them with the focused pleasure of someone who was planting something that would grow. She had established herself in the community around Irwin with the gradual naturalness of someone who was not performing belonging but simply being present consistently enough that it developed on its own. The woman at the post office knew her name now. The man who ran the hardware store in town had started setting aside interesting wood scraps for her after she mentioned she was thinking about building picture frames. Garrett Blackwell stopped by every 2 weeks to check on things he did not need to check on, which Fern understood was his way of being a neighbor without making a production of it. She had called Opal every Sunday evening, and the calls had gotten longer and easier. The early awkwardness of the Petra incident dissolving gradually into the familiar rhythm of two sisters who had known each other their whole lives and were learning in their late 50s and early 60s how to talk to each other as equals rather than as the roles their family had assigned them decades ago. Opal was coming for Thanksgiving. She had already asked what she should bring, and Fern had said, "Just yourself," and had meant it. She had a showing in February. She had work she believed in. She had 5 acres of Tennessee mountain that belonged to her in every legal and spiritual sense of the word. She had a journal from a grandmother who had walked this exact path before her and left her the map. On a Thursday evening in the 6th week of painting, she carried a finished canvas outside and propped it against the porch railing and stepped back to look at it in the last of the daylight. The painting was large, dominated by the ridge line and the quality of light she had been chasing for weeks the specific way late afternoon sun moves through trees at elevation. But at its center, visible only if you look carefully, was the shape of a door, slightly open, with light coming through it from the other side. She had not planned it. Her hand had placed it there without consulting her conscious mind, which was how she knew it was true. She stood looking at the door in her painting and thought about all the doors that had brought her here. The door of the dormitory storage room she had turned into her first studio. The door of the house on Birchwood Drive she had walked out of for the last time. The door of the yellow spare room she had closed behind her on a Friday morning in June. And the door of this cabin which had opened on hinges that groaned like something waking up and had led her back to the woman she had been before 30 years of marriage taught her to occupy less space. She went inside and opened Lark's journal to the last page. The final entry written in ink that was darker than the rest, as if Lark had pressed harder, wanting the words to last. "I do not keep this cabin for myself. I found my home a long time ago. I keep it for whoever comes after me. Maybe Fern, maybe someone Fern will love, maybe someone whose name I will never know. This cabin is not a place to hide. It is a place to begin again. And there is always someone who needs to begin again." Fern closed the journal and set it on the kitchen table beside the notarized deed and the handwritten statement from Sterling in the letter on blue stationery that had started everything. 4 documents on a wooden table. The deed that proved the land was hers. The letter that told her she was worth finding. The legal proof that her grandmother had protected her from beyond the grave. And the handwritten acknowledgement from a man who had finally, after 30 years, put on paper that she had existed. She looked at them for a long time. Then she picked up her coffee and walked out to the porch and sat in the chair with the curved back, the one Lark had always claimed was the most comfortable chair in Tennessee, and watched the sun go down over the ridge. Fern Hargrove was 58 years old. She had 5 acres of mountain land and a cabin with a stone fireplace and a porch that faced west. She had a gallery showing in 4 months and 9 paintings that said things she had spent 3 decades not saying. She had seed catalogs and hiking boots and a grandmother's journal and a toolbox with instructions taped inside the lid. She had a sister who was learning to stop caring other people's opinions. She had a community that was beginning to know her name because she had earned it rather than performed it. She was not healed. She understood that the way you understand weather, it would come and go. There would be mornings when the loss arrived and pressed down and she would sit with it and breathe and wait. But she was moving. She was working. She was making things with her hands that had not existed before she made them. And every single one of those things was telling her the same truth her grandmother had written on blue stationery 30 years ago and hidden in a tin box at the bottom of a suitcase, waiting with the extraordinary patience of love that knows exactly what it is protecting and exactly how long it might need to wait. She was still here, She had always been here, and the life she was building on this mountain with her own hands and her own vision and her own stubbornness was not a consolation prize for the one she had lost. It was the one she had been meant to live all along. She had just needed a key and a letter and the courage to drive into the mountains and find it. Fern Hargrove was 58 years old, and she was just getting started. If this story moves something in you that needed moving, if you have ever handed over pieces of yourself, one small compromise at a time until you looked up one day and barely recognized the life you were living, if you have ever needed someone to remind you that losing everything is not always the end, then this story was for you. Leave one word in the comments that describes what you would do if you found a key to a place that was entirely yours. Because Fern's story proves that it is never too late to unlock the door, that what gets buried in us does not die, that the life we were always meant to live has a way of waiting for us with extraordinary patience in the places that have always known our name. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their story is not over and that the key has been in their hands the whole time. Welcome to She Found Her Way Home. Up next, you have got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you will not want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And do not forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you do not miss any upload.